While there are many things that need retconning in The Last Jedi,
let's start with one of the simplest to fix.
Reimagining Star Wars. It's time
to engage your reimagination.
Reimagine with us by subscribing and clicking that bell button.
So we are all aware when Admiral Holdo hyperspace rammed the Supremacy, destroying it, and most of the First Order fleet pursuing the Resistance.
What Thor Skywalker called the moment that broke Star Wars, or what the Ringer calls the most breathtaking moment in The Last Jedi, that is also the greatest threat to Star Wars lore.
The frightening truth about Vice Admiral Holdo's unprecedented tactic.
Visually, sonically, and emotionally, Holdo's maneuver is an incredible moment. The knowledge of what she intends to do creeps up on us just as it dawns on members of the desperate Resistance and triumphant First Order, who first suspect that she's either trying to save herself or to create a diversion to distract the First Order from its attack on the fleeing Resistance transports. Then we see understanding register on the faces of Commander Dameron and General Hux, and finally feel it reflected in ours.
Oh my gosh, she's going to jump!
For a fleeting instant, we hear nothing from the sound system or from any nearby spectators who are seeing the film for the first time. No breathing, no popcorn sifting, no rapid wrinkling. Then we see Snoke's B-2 bomber-shaped ship, the Supremacy, sliced in two by the passage of the now vaporized resistant cruiser, the Raddus. The Supremacy, its stricken smaller companions, and the Raddus's remains hanging there, suspended in the silent tableau of beautiful black and white death. As soon as Holdo turns toward the Supremacy, Hux understands the danger, and no one is shocked that the tactic works.
Yet as far as we know, there's no perfect precedent in Star Wars canon for what Holdo did.
We've seen many ships make the jump to light speed, and we know what that looks like. The stars elongate into lines, which then become a blue coruscating wormhole-like tunnel. We even saw Rebel ships jumping to light speed run into Vader's Star Destroyer in Rogue One.
We know that a ship entering hyperspace emits radiation and blasts anything in its wake. We saw that in The Force Awakens and even more clearly in a recent episode of the Star Wars Rebels. You don't want to be directly behind or adjacent to a ship as it jumps.
Based on what we knew before The Last Jedi, though, I would have assumed that because hyperspace is an alternate dimension that's separate from normal space, a ship entering hyperspace wouldn't collide with a normal space object in front of it, as the Raddus does the Supremacy. We did know that giant celestial objects in normal space project gravitational mass shadows that extend into hyperspace and interfere with flight. In Star Wars canon, a ship called interdictor cruisers project giant gravity wells that can pull ships out of hyperspace or prevent them from jumping. When Han warns Luke in A New Hope that without precise calculations we could fly right through a star, or bounce too close to a supernova, and that'd end your trip real quick, wouldn't it? He probably means that a star's mass shadow would yank a ship out of hyperspace so suddenly and so close to its surface that destruction would be inevitable. Another canonical novel makes clear that hyperdrives have a safety feature that prevents them from functioning too close in proximity to a gravity well, although that feature can be overridden.
We will put a card right here on how hyperspace most likely works in Star Wars in a later video.
So even if the Supremacy was large enough to cast a mass shadow that would draw the Raddus out of hyperspace, the real speed in real space is not fast enough to create the mass damage of the collision that we see. Any ship jumping to hyperspace would not be moving at light speed in real space. So if that hyperspace collision can happen, then there's no reason to think that any other two ships couldn't collide. And that's where the rules break down.
A hyperspace collision, The Last Jedi seems to tell us, can't be avoided. Unlike a collision at sublight speed, it's essentially instantaneous.
Based on the carnage the Raddus wrought, the impact is extremely powerful and impossible to prevent. Any sufficiently large craft could easily destroy any ship or ships of its choice. This would be a battle-ending. By the Force, it's a war-ending weapon, and now we know it's fully operational. Let's try to explain this thorny issue this way. For one thing, the maneuver as shown requires Holdo to sacrifice herself, a significant disincentive. But in Star Wars lore, hyperspace travel has existed for millennia. Are we supposed to believe that this idea didn't occur to anyone else in those ages? Or that no one else had the nerve? Given that multiple Resistance members sacrificed themselves to take out the enemy ships in The Last Jedi alone, that's impossible to believe. Hyperspace ramming is an ideal guerrilla or terrorist tactic, and unfortunately one with plenty of conceptual precedence on Earth.
More to the point though, this didn't have to be a suicide run.
Hyperspace jumps are plotted by computers, and droid ships are already in Star Wars staple. There's no reason navies couldn't construct unmanned ships to take on this task. And while ships like the Radish are costly, an unmanned vessel the same size that exists only to serve as a relativistic battering ram wouldn't necessarily need to be expensive. I mean, couldn't you just stockpile a bunch of old ships that were destined for the graveyard and instead ram them into other ships? Honestly, if you think too much about what occurred in The Last Jedi, you'll be thinking with every other space battle, you'll think, well, why didn't they? And in the future, you'll think, well, why don't they?
Thus far, Lucasfilm has been mostly silent. Do they realize that Star Wars is ruined until they retcon this weakness away? How deep does the cover-up go? What is Lucasfilm hiding?
So while we are aware that the novel attempted to explain that this was possible because of an experimental deflector shield system, it really doesn't make sense. Why would a 34-year-old ship, yes, that is how old the Radish is, have an experimental shield? So then how do we simply retcon the Holdo maneuver?
Good news, this retcon will fix two ridiculous aspects of The Last Jedi: hyperspace ramming and hyperspace tracking.
So if hyperspace is in another dimension, how does the First Order track in a dimension that is not observable by standard means? The current explanation is that it is a quantum computer that derives the most likely destination of the ship jumping through hyperspace. However, this explanation is severely lacking. Why? Because a hyperdrive computer is a quantum computer that calculates the necessary path through a moving, rotating, gravitationally diverse galaxy for the incredible speed ships travel through hyperspace, a system utilized to move halfway across a 120,000 light-year galaxy in hours and days. This is the equivalent of driving on the freeway across the United States at 767 miles per hour, or Mach speed, avoiding every crack, uneven edge, and pothole along the way. The hyperdrive computer would do this without having all the records of where these road hazards are. So given the trajectory, another hyperdrive computer could calculate the most likely destinations, no tracker needed. So before you go and say that space is mostly empty, here's what science says is the likely density of the interstellar space.
To estimate the density of the debris field, they get that in order for us to have seen this one object in the 5 years we've been watching with Pan-STARRS, there must be roughly 700 trillion objects per cubic parsec in the solar neighbourhood. Now, that's higher than the density of comet-like objects in the Oort cloud.
So given the explanation of the A-class processor not being a tracker, then it is no more than what the Empire Rebels already had.
So then what would a tracker be? If the First Order had a tracker, it would be one that would lock onto the unique signature of a spacecraft and be able to detect it in hyperspace despite any change in distance within 3D space.
How would it do this?
Well, in order to do this, a device would have to open a wormhole into hyperspace and have detectors sensitive enough to sense the opposing ship's signature. The unique signature is why they can only track one ship. A tracker holding open the wormhole destabilizes the hyperspace region enough to prevent other ships from tracking the opposing ships from the same region concurrently.
Now for the hyperspace ram.
Under normal conditions, a hyperspace ram would not be possible. However, when a tracker is being employed, the ram is possible. The opposing ship can jump into hyperspace and back down the wormhole into the First Order tracking ship, creating the collision in real space. This appears to the observer to be a white streak instead of the ship simply disappearing into hyperspace.
This fixes the problem of both hyperspace ramming and tracking with one retcon. So here is the simple scene that can retcon it in 9 or any other Star Wars movie.
Internal Star Destroyer bridge, space. The commander leans over the tracking officer as they observe the rebel resistant craft turning around.
Sir, they're assuming a ramming position.
Not that again. Quick, disable the tracker. Internal resistance transport, cockpit, space. The pilot pulls back the hyperspace lever as he looks back to the passengers. The stars stretch.
Watch this.
What are you doing?
They won't be tracking us now.
Internal Star Destroyer, bridge, space. The transport jumps to hyperspace toward the Star Destroyer. Turn off the tracker! The commander dives to the deck as the jumping ship disappears over the Star Destroyer. End scene.
Is this the perfect retcon?
Maybe not, but it's definitely good enough and quick to explain in 10 to 30 seconds. It fixes 2 problems introduced into Star Wars by The Last Jedi.
What do you think?
Let us know in the comments below.
Get subscribe!
Share and watch more stories, theories, and retcons by clicking the end screens. Bye! Holdo. I said Holdo. Crap.